And hello there.
Hello there.
How are you doing this evening? Welcome to Restoration Messianic Fellowship on our Wednesday night teaching, and we're getting some things going, set up as usual, so it's giving everybody a couple minutes to get ready and get started. We're here on Facebook, we are here on YouTube, and so hopefully, man, we need to work out a way to make like phone calls and have some.
Everybody share and like.
Yeah, share and like the video and send that around, and we'll get her going. So
Hope you have your Bibles, because we're going to be in different places tonight.
see, I'm even sharing and liking the video. What do you think of that? You can share yourself. It's kind of creepy.
Yeah, you might want to watch how you phrase that.
Share your own videos. It is a possible thing.
Okay.
Well, so tonight we are going to start. We're going to be starting talking about the covenants a little bit and what exactly gets involved in all of that. And so these are subjects that most of us probably did not really grow up with in significant discussion.
Very true. Not even in seminary did we get the discussion we're about to have tonight.
Yeah, and so there's things that are out there called covenant theology. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the actual covenants as they appear in the scriptures.
Right.
Because it's really the covenants that address God's redemptive plan and the steps along the way to redeem and restore His people, and that all of them working out together are essential for that purpose and for that cause. So rather than talking about all of them tonight, because that would be rushing through them, what we're going to do tonight is really start with the first covenant of our redemption, and that is the covenant of Abraham.
The Abrahamic Covenant.
So let's start back in Genesis chapter 12.
And you're probably sitting there thinking, really? The Abrahamic Covenant? I know that. I know that covenant.
Do you though?
But do you though?
Because you would have asked me beforehand, just even within the last year or two, if I thought I understood the Abrahamic Covenant, and I would have said, well, of course. But there's a whole lot more going on in that covenant and in what it means and its significance for the purpose and plan of God.
Amen.
that had never really noticed before. And so, I mean, some of this will sound familiar, but just there's ways of talking about it that really
make things click.
Yeah, they do. The whole thing, it fits together in ways that never caught on to before.
Because the covenants, they all work together. They're not just individual covenants. They end up being a package.
Yeah.
And when we get to the new covenant, we'll really see that. So as we go through the covenants, and of course tonight we're doing the Abrahamic Covenant, just keep that in mind, that eventually we're going to talk about the new covenant, and all three, the Abrahamic, the Mosaic, and the Davidic covenants become a package. So, and they're all essential for each other, and none of them negate any of the others.
Yeah, and so before we start on that, that's what I was going to share. If you've been a part of the Galatians study message series, within the last few months, you'll remember this passage. This is Galatians chapter 3, and he's contrasting the covenant of Abraham versus the covenant at Sinai, the Mosaic covenant. And so those are the two covenants trying to address the misconceptions and misunderstandings of those two covenants is really what is at the heart of the book of Galatians. And if you don't understand the covenants, then you're going to not get that correct. So Galatians chapter 3, verse 15, he says, "Brothers and sisters, I speak in human terms. Even with a man's covenant, once it has been confirmed, no one cancels it or adds to it. And that's important. God keeps his word. He keeps his covenant. It's not. He is never going to break the covenant.
So you can't take that covenant away, and you can't add to it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Nobody has the authority to do that once it's been confirmed. He says, now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed.
Mm-hmm.
So where does the covenant of our redemption start? Or who does it start with? It doesn't start with Moses. It doesn't start at Mount Sinai.
No.
It starts with Abraham.
Yes.
So he says the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. It doesn't say and to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to your seed, who is the Messiah. So Messiah, Yeshua, is in the Abrahamic covenant.
Very much so.
He is the one to whom the promises are spoken, and the one to whom or through whom the promises will be fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
So what I am saying, this is verse 17, is this: the Torah, which was the terms of the Mosaic covenant, the way of life that was laid out at Mount Sinai.
Yes, when it says Torah or law, it's referring to the Mosaic covenant
In Galatians.
in most cases. So you just keep that in mind, because the Abrahamic covenant is a part of the Torah, the books of Moses,
Mm-hmm.
right? So when the New Testament a lot of times refers to the law or to the Torah, it's specifically referring most of the time to the Mosaic covenant.
Yes. So what I'm saying is this: the Torah, or the law, or the Mosaic covenant, which came 430 years later,
After the Abrahamic covenant,
does not cancel the covenant previously confirmed by God, so as to make the promise ineffective. So even though, the Judaizers of Paul's day, who were trying to get the Gentiles to live by or keep the terms of the Mosaic covenant before being saved, they were emphasizing that, but the Mosaic covenant doesn't negate the promise which was given to Abram and Abraham.
and our salvation is based on a promise.
Our salvation is based on the promise.
So let's take a look at the Abrahamic covenant.
Yep.
Okay? The Abrahamic covenant, if you want to go back to Genesis, is in Genesis chapter 12, chapter 15, and chapter 17. All of them are a part of the Abrahamic covenant.
Mm-hmm.
So, Genesis chapter 12.
And so we know this passage, Then Adonai said to Abram, get going out from your land and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. This is out of the TLV, the Tree of Life version. He says, my heart's desire is to make you into a great nation, to bless you, to make your name great, so that you may be a blessing. He says, I will bless those who bless you, but whoever curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. And I'm going to stop there for just a moment, because that's usually as far as we ever got, talking about, to a large extent, the Abrahamic covenant. There's Israel, there's I will bless those who bless you, I will curse those who curse you. That's a lot of what I mostly knew about that.
I mean, it starts out very personal, right?
Mm-hmm.
I will make you a great nation. Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation. That was personal, right?
Mm-hmm.
That would lead to a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. That was personal,
Mm-hmm.
right? And of course, this covenant, this Abrahamic covenant, gets passed on to Isaac and gets passed on to Jacob. Mm-hmm. And so many times in Scripture, God is referred to as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so God definitely made Abraham's name great.
Mm-hmm.
So in many ways, this starts out personal and then goes to his people, to the people of Israel, and eventually, and more specifically, even to the Messiah, to Yeshua.
Mm-hmm. And something that just clicked in my head when you said that, who is the only, in that respect, the only person or the only one to whom all the covenants are included. Who's the only ones that's included in all of the covenants? You know, the Mosaic, Abraham was not. Well,
What are you trying to
I'm
say?
I'm working it out. I'm thinking
something.
in my head. You know that Moses was
on
not
camera even.
Moses wasn't there at the Abrahamic Covenant. You know, David wasn't there at the Abrahamic Covenant.
No.
But Abraham was there, and then his seed was included at every one subsequent.
Right.
But it's important that we start with that, with the Genesis 12. You know, I will bless you, those who bless you, whoever curses you, I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. That last line is the one that we kind of understood, but didn't really understand the full implications of it until we really started looking at the book of Galatians.
Oh, yeah.
Because all the families of the earth will be blessed. Well, we take that and understand that as like, yes, through Abram, through that, what God is doing here, you know, he brings the Messiah, and we have come to faith in that, through that, and that's all well and true. But Galatians chapter 3, verse 8 puts it like this, that the scriptures, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, proclaimed the gospel, proclaimed the good news to Abraham in advance, saying, all the nations shall be blessed through you. So that was showing Abraham all the way back there. God was revealing to him, Abraham, this is more than just redeeming of you and your individual children, or your direct descendants, your physical descendants, things like that. It is going to be through all the nations will be blessed by the terms of this covenant.
Yes, and Abraham was always kind of, the term I have in my head is a mixed bag, in terms of his children, in terms of his descendants, in terms of his heirs. Because if you remember, the first person Abraham kind of takes in is Lot, his nephew, after his brother dies. And then, you know, you have Abraham making his way down through Damascus and into the land of Canaan, right? And he's gathering people as he goes. And he was famous for that. He was famous for taking in people who wanted to learn more about his God. And one of those servants that he ends up having from Damascus is the one he expects to be his heir. We'll see that in just a few minutes, because he had no physical children yet. And then, of course, he has Ishmael, and then Isaac, who's the son of the promise, and then other physical children. And so Abraham was always kind of surrounded by every aspect, you know, relatives that aren't his direct descendants, people from the nations within his tent, within his camp, that have joined him, and his physical children. And so that in and of itself tells us that Abraham, who was willing to take in whoever was willing to listen and learn about his God, have a place in this covenant.
Very much
and God confirms that to him right here.
So there's that passage, you know, about in you all the families of the earth will be blessed, and that's what Paul hangs a lot of his argument on in terms of the inclusion of the Gentiles.
Yes.
But when you go down back in Genesis 12 to like the terms, it says in verse 7, then Adonai appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your seed. So there he built an altar to Adonai who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the mountain to the east of Bethel and erected his tent. There he built an altar to Adonai and called on the name of Adonai. So what's interesting in that, there was the two things that he was promising to give to Abram in these events. He was going to have descendants or seed,
Right?
and that was spoken to a man who at the time was childless.
Yes.
And he was going to give the land, and that was spoken to a man who at the time was a sojourner in the land who had no possession in the land at all.
Correct.
So those were the two things. And so the course of the next few chapters is when we start seeing God fulfilling those promises that he said he was going to do.
Or at least giving Abraham a greater glimpse of
Yes.
that. And in terms of the land. And then with the children, definitely he starts having children.
Mm-hmm.
But, and again, Galatians talks about seed as to one, right? And not just the direct descendants of all of Israel. That seed, of course, is Messiah, is Yeshua. But he is king over Israel. Messiah is king of Israel, right? Mm-hmm. So what is given to the king is given to the people.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we have to keep in mind that yes, we have here the idea that seed is seed as in one being Messiah, but it is also talking about the physical children of Israel. Both the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, both Israel and Messiah are called, the firstborn Son of God.
Mm-hmm. And Messiah acts as a representative of the whole, of the kingdom.
As king.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the next element really starts in chapter 14.
Oh, definitely.
With the aspects of the covenant continuing, the terms and the ideas of the covenant being expressed. And in chapter 14, that's where Lot is there in the surrounding areas of Sodom and Gomorrah. He gets captured, he gets taken off by the kings, and Abraham goes on a rescue mission for him.
Abraham was a warrior. We don't often think of him that way, but he was a warrior.
I mean, how many men did it say he had? He had only about 300 some odd fighting men, and he goes out and takes on these 5 kings and their military units, and he cleans it up, and he rescues everybody. Is it 4?
Yeah, 4.
Anyway, so Abram rescues Lot, and then something happens on their way back, and what happens on the way back is really what starts to initiate and inaugurate this covenant being firmly established, as the language in Galatians talked about.
Let me ask you this. Who wants to be the mediator of the covenant?
Who wants to be?
Who wants to be? Who wants to be the one who imparts things to Abraham, or Abram at this point?
I'm not sure I know where you're going.
The king of Sodom.
Oh, well, yeah.
He wants to be the one who Abraham looks to.
Right, and you'll see that in this passage. It says, chapter 14, verse 17, after he returned from defeating Cheder Laomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. Okay, so the king of Sodom goes out to try and be that lead guy. Yeah. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, for he was a priest of El Elyon, God Most High. And so Sodom, the king of Sodom, there's no indication he brings anything.
No.
But Melchizedek, he brings the bread and the wine. And it should be reminiscent of what you see in the pages of the New Testament.
But how do we know this is part of the covenant issue?
You might be wanting me to get a little bit too far ahead.
Well, I mean, you just brought up the bread and the wine, so
right.
How do we know this is part of the issue of covenant?
Well, when there is a covenant that is established, there is always a meal.
Yes.
There is a meal as a part of the of the service or the time of recognition of the covenant. And we know that there's at least a closing meal, but there's also the opening of negotiations kind of thing going on here as well.
Well, of course, we've already had a part of the covenant being given.
Right, or the promises being given in
Right.
chapter 12.
So now we see the meal of the covenant.
The legal side of things
Yes.
happening. This is the legal side. And so Melchizedek comes out. He was the king of Salem. He brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of El Elyon. And that's important because that shows up in the New Testament. Some of y'all know
That's
that.
God Most High, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
He blessed him. He blessed Abram and said, "Blessed be Abram by El Elyon, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be El Elyon, who gave over your enemies into your hand." And then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. So he participates in this meal with Melchizedek, and he recognizes Melchizedek's authority, or he recognizes Melchizedek's unique place. When he doesn't do that with the king of Sodom,
No, he kind of
he
dismisses him.
gets rid of him.
I don't want anything to do with you.
Because what happens next? After he gives him the tenth to Melchizedek, the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the people, the possessions take for yourself." But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I raise my hand in oath to Adonai, El Elyon, creator of heaven and earth. Not a thread or even a sandal strap of all that is yours will I take, so that you will not say that I have made Abram great or rich. I claim nothing but what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me. Aner, Eschol, and Mamre, let them take their share."
Because who's going to make Abram great?
Yeah,
Who's
only
going to make
God.
his name great? Yeah.
Only the Father is going to make
El
him great.
Elyon.
So he receives, or he accepts, that ministry of mediation through Melchizedek, and he rejects Sodom from that role.
And I find it interesting that God is being referred to here as El Elyon, or God Most High, or God of the hosts, right? Because Abram's just coming back from a battle. And so he's declaring, who's the one who really fought for me? Who's the one that won this battle? I might have been used by El Elyon to fight the battle, but El Elyon won the battle. And to me, that's pretty significant. You have the meal there. You also have a blessing there. And who's blessing who?
Well, the greater always blesses the lesser.
Whose name's going to be made great?
And yeah, Abram's going to be
Abram.
great.
But who's greater?
Melchizedek. So that shows up within the discussions in the New Testament, particularly the book of Hebrews.
Absolutely.
But chapter 15 says, after these things, the word of Adonai came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not fear, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward." And this is where Abram starts asking, "Okay, well, yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah.
When's this going to happen?" Basically, he says, "But Abram said, My Lord Adonai, what will you give me, since I am living without children?" Remember, the promise was about seed and descendants. "What will you give me, since I am living without children? And the heir of my household is Eliezer of Damascus." Then Abram said, "Look, you have given me no seed, so a house-born servant is my heir." And then behold, the word of Adonai came to him, saying, "This one will not be your heir, but in fact one who will come from your own body will be your heir." He took him outside and said, "Look up now at the sky and count the stars, if you are able to count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your seed be. So shall your descendants be." And then the key element in terms of what Abraham is contributing to this situation is here in verse 6. It says, "Then he believed in Adonai, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness."
I find it interesting that he says, your heir, not heirs, but your heir will be a child, not children, from your own body. And of course, ultimately that's Isaac. He had other children physically, but Isaac was that one. But ultimately, that one who would inherit, the heir of Abraham, is Messiah.
That's right. That's right. So there's even in the plural singular elements of the language are telling to how these things are fulfilled. But it says he believed in Adonai, and God, he reckoned it to him as righteousness. So what did Abram have to do to receive or to agree to this covenant? Didn't he just have to believe?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
He wasn't bringing anything really to the table.
No.
He wasn't bringing his works. He wasn't
he
bringing
just-
his righteousness.
He had to follow.
He had to believe. And he had to believe for a long time.
Yeah, he did.
Because the child of promise didn't come for, what, 25 years? So we would have probably given up on that one by then. But he had to believe in what God was saying was true and that he would do it. And so you skipping down just a little bit, and we may go back, but it says in verse 18, on that day Adonai cut a covenant with Abram, saying, I give this land to your seed, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates River. And the Kenite, the Kenizzites, and all these different people there he mentions.
But how did they ratify this covenant?
How did they ratify this covenant? Well, that's where you back up a little bit.
Yeah, that's where you back up a little bit.
But I said we were going to back up. I said we were going to back up. He says, I am the Lord, I am Adonai, who brought you up out of the Ur of the Chaldees in order to give you this land to inherit it. So he said, my Lord, how will I know that I will inherit it? Then God said to him, bring me a 3-year-old cow, a young cow, a 3-year-old she-goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young bird. And so he brought all these to him and cut them in half and put each piece opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds. Then birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. And when the sun was about to set, and a deep sleep fell on Abram, behold, terror of great darkness was falling upon him. Then he said to Abram, know for certain that your seed will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I am going to judge the nation that they will serve. Afterward they will go out with many possessions. But you will come to your fathers in peace, and you will be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And when the sun set and it became dark, behold, there was a smoking oven and fiery torch that passed between these pieces.
Now this is an ancient covenant, right? This was the way they made covenant back in Abram's day. This was nothing special in terms of how to do a covenant. The odd thing about how this covenant is carried out is that instead of both of them passing through these animals, only one is passing through the animals. Because usually when two men would make a covenant and they would cut these animals, they would both walk through those cut up animals as if to say, if I do not keep the terms of this covenant, you can do to me what we just did to these animals.
My life is forfeit. My life is over.
If I do not keep the terms of this covenant. For this covenant in Genesis 15, what do we see? We see the cutting up of the animals, but then Abram falls into this deep sleep. He's out. And only God passes through the animals. Only God is responsible for seeing that the terms of these covenants, of this covenant, will be completely fulfilled. And part of that covenant is the promise of the redemption of Abraham's children from slavery or the world of sin. Okay?
That's a very important point. When you look forward ahead into the Exodus, because with the whole argument of Galatians that we've been talking about, we have to realize and understand that the Israelites were not saved under the terms of the Mosaic Covenant. They were not redeemed from Egypt under the terms of the Mosaic Covenant.
They were not justified under the terms of the Mosaic Covenant. Which is interesting because even, and we'll probably talk about this again when we talk about the Mosaic Covenant, but even within Judaism, when they do blessings and they talk about, how do most of them start? Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us by your commandments. Not justifies us, but sanctifies us.
Sets us apart.
The Mosaic Covenant was never about justification. Not even in the minds of the Jewish people. But for the Jewish people in Yeshua's day, they saw themselves as having already been redeemed or justified because they were brought out of Egypt. And they were brought out by what?
Well, by the outstretched arm and the blood of the
mighty hand, the outstretched arm, and
the blood of the Lamb.
The blood of the Lamb. Went through the waters of baptism in the Red Sea. Right? All before they get to the mountain where they receive the Mosaic Covenant.
You know, something struck me just reading through this that I'd never really thought of before. So here I am, I'm thinking on camera again. And that's always a dangerous thing.
Dangerous pastime, I know.
But where he talks about bringing the 3-year-old young cow, 3-year-old she-goat, 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young bird. When you get into to Leviticus and such like that, and they talked about all the different elements and sacrifices and things, this seems to run the gambit of all of the levels that somebody could offer. Somebody who is wealthy could always bring,
which Abraham was.
Which Abraham definitely was. He would be able to bring something as large as a big sacrifice like a cow or an ox or something else like that. But if someone was poor, what could they bring? They could bring a turtle dove or a young pigeon, just like Mary and Joseph did at the time that they brought Yeshua into the temple. And so it struck me when looking at that list of the different things that they were supposed to bring that Abram brought, is that this runs the gambit from rich to poor.
Yes. And
so it doesn't matter whether you are rich or poor, you have a place, here at this covenant.
Absolutely.
So that's my thinking on camera.
That was a good thinking on camera.
It worked that time.
It worked.
What a shock. But in any event, so the redemption of the people, that's the key thing. When you look at Exodus, and you get to Exodus chapter 11, 12, and 13, and those types of things, as they're getting through the period of the plagues, you get to chapter 12 with the Passover lamb. We have to keep in mind that the Mosaic Covenant has not been given.
Right.
So everything that happens that here at the Exodus about the redemption from Egypt is happening under the terms of the covenant that's already been ratified.
So that when God tells them later to practice and observe the Passover, to remember their exodus from Egypt, what he is in essence telling them is remember your redemption and what it cost. Because it cost a great deal. It was not free.
No. And also remember the terms of how one entered into participation in this covenant.
Right.
Abraham, what did he do? He believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. The Israelites in Egypt, did they have to believe God?
Absolutely.
Yeah. How did they demonstrate that they believed God?
By putting the blood on the
By putting the blood on the doorposts. Or even before that, during the plagues, they believed God that when he said he was going to send the hailstones, that they brought their animals in.
That's right.
And even some Egyptians started to believe God. So it was believed that God gave his word, and he said he's going to do something, then he's going to do it. And your belief is then demonstrated by your
actions.
Follow-up, your actions from that.
That sounds like James.
It sure does. Faith without works
is dead.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe, but I'm not bringing my cows in.
And so that was...
Then do you really believe, right?
That was the essence of Paul's argument, and you get to Galatians in talking about the covenants and talking about that how these Gentiles who are coming to want to believe and want to be included as the people of God, they couldn't. Could they come in by the terms of the Mosaic covenant?
No.
Why not?
They hadn't been redeemed yet.
Yeah. Not even the Israelites, not even the Jewish people were redeemed under the terms of the Mosaic covenant. They were redeemed.
And again, they saw themselves that way, right? And really what, in Galatians, what you're seeing with the Judaizers are Jewish believers trying to get these Gentiles to almost renounce their salvation, go back to being unsaved, and then go through the Jewish legal process of becoming a legal Jew, and then come to the Jewish Messiah.
Yeah, because Messiah was only for the Jewish people. See, that element about all nations being blessed through you was being lost.
Yes.
This was not a blessing for everyone to experience. This was a blessing unique for us and to us, as Jewish people only.
Right. And
Paul is making the point that no, it's always been intended to have a tent big enough to include everybody. And by faith.
Even if you just talk about the circumcision, right? Because circumcision did become kind of a shorthand term to mean everything that it takes to become a legal Jew. But even if you just go, okay, well, circumcision itself, what are they asking the Gentiles to do? Again, almost pretty much to renounce their salvation, go back and go through that process, which part of it was circumcision. They're asking them to put circumcision before redemption. Circumcision before belief. Was that the order of Abraham? Did Abraham receive a circumcision before he believed?
No, he did not.
No.
He heard the promise in chapter 12. He started the meal in chapter 14 with Melchizedek.
So Melchizedek is the priest of the Abrahamic Covenant.
Yes.
Not Aaron.
Correct. The Levitical priesthood doesn't exist at this point. So the Passover, Aaron was not a priest. Even though he was alive, Aaron was not yet a priest.
Correct.
So the priest of the Abrahamic covenant is Melchizedek. And he is the one who is the priest of our redemption, of the people of God. Which, what does Hebrews say about Yeshua? He said, he makes the point, it's like, hey, by the Torah, by the law, Yeshua would not be a priest because he couldn't be a priest. Because he's not of the tribe of Levi.
Right.
So he can't be a priest in that sense, operating with those terms outlined at Sinai, that were given at Sinai.
The Mosaic Covenant.
The Mosaic Covenant. But he can be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. In fact, he can be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek.
Because he's part of the Abrahamic covenant.
And so that is the covenant of our redemption.
And what you're going to see as we talk about these things, it's not that one is more important than the other. It's not that one supersedes the other or cancels another. But the issue is the proper order of the covenants. Order, God is a God of order. Order is a big deal to him.
Yes, it is.
And we as human beings tend to get God's order out of order.
We think we can do it on our own.
We think we can arrange it better.
Well, it's kind of like, for all of you dads out there that think that you're smart enough to put the bicycle together without really looking at the instructions. We're all pretty good at that, or we think we're pretty good at it until we get to the end and we like, oh, look, I still have several parts that I didn't put in there.
Or even put a swing set together without instructions.
I wouldn't know anything about that.
That happened to me when I was little. I love you, Daddy.
But it's that type of thing. We think we can figure out how to do it or what order to do it in better than he can. But this is his order for the redemption of God's people. These are the steps that he wants to take his people through in order to get us to the goal, which is
the kingdom.
The kingdom, or his presence.
Remember, it's the gospel of the kingdom, right? So he's taking us from sinful man, who he had to kick out of the garden, to being able to be in his presence. Well, it starts with the Abrahamic covenant. That's not the final. Well,
that's step one.
The final thing, but it begins with the Abrahamic covenant. It's about the proper order.
So it's step one in a 3 or 4 step process.
Yes.
So if you want to look at it like that. And you can't move on to, you shouldn't try to start with step 2.
No.
You shouldn't be able to skip any of the steps in order to get there. If you remember doing those proofs, in geometry or whatever else.
I hated those.
You're not allowed to, you have to show your work kind of thing. You can't skip any steps.
I was good at that. I was good at skipping steps. That's what algebra had taught me to do. And then all of a sudden my geometry teacher says, don't do that. Right? I'm like, wait a minute. I'm good at that. Don't do that.
But with God's way of doing things, you can't start in the middle.
No.
You can't skip any steps.
No.
All of them have to be fulfilled, or you go through all of them to reach the destination or the goal. And the goal of the Torah is
Yeshua.
Yeshua is Messiah.
And I've heard you say, and well, back up just a second. It's Yeshua, and after all, even Yeshua said, Moses wrote about me, wrote about him, Yeshua.
That's John chapter 5.
But I've heard you say many times that not even the Israelites, right, were expected to obey the Torah, the Mosaic Covenant, before God would bring them out of Egypt, redeem them out of Egypt.
That's true. Yeah,
right? They didn't even have that yet. They didn't know what it was. And when we come to Messiah, when we come to the Lord and we experience justification and salvation, we don't know what the Mosaic Covenant is either. We don't know what this life with God really looks like, what he's going to ask of us. We come in faith, in trusting him that he's provided the means of our redemption, and he's going to teach us how to live.
We come the same way that Abraham came.
Right.
We believe God. We believe God in his plan. That passage in verse 8 says that it proclaimed the good news to Abraham in advance. So God showed him all of this in some form or fashion, and he believed it.
Here's in Galatians 3.
That's that passage back in Galatians. It says in verse 6, backing up, it says, just as Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness, know then that those who have faith are children of Abraham.
Right.
Those who we have to come, we are justified in the same way that Abraham was justified. We believe.
Yes.
We believe in what God has said he was going to do. We believe in what God has provided for his people.
And in the same way, his descendants, the people of Israel, were redeemed out of the land of Egypt. They believed that God was going to do this, and so they followed his instructions, and they followed Moses, right? Who in Judaism is known as the first redeemer.
Yeah.
Right? Messiah is the final redeemer. But everything Moses did, he was acting as that
As a mediator.
intermediator.
Intermediary.
Yeah, I can't. Yeah. Intermediary between God and the people. Right. So that's why they call him that. But when we can't get these things out of order, right? Again, there's the promise that God gave him Abram in chapter 12. There's the terms of the covenant in chapter 15.
The sealing of it with the meal, the covenant meal.
And then you go to Genesis 17. Right? And in Genesis 17, we finally see the sign of the covenant. In other words, the evidence that the covenant has been made and that both parties have agreed to the terms of the covenant. Right?
So that's chapter 17, and he's talking about the covenant of circumcision.
Yes.
And that is all, again, that's all the laying out, the progressive revelation, I guess is the fancy term for it, for the Abrahamic covenant. You know, it says, now Abram was 99 years old. Now Adonai appeared to Abram and said to him, I am El Shaddai. Continually walk before me, and you will be blameless.
Well, hold on there for a second.
Sure.
Blameless, walk in my presence. Mine even says pure-hearted. Walk before me and be blameless. Live the life I want you to live. I've set these terms of this covenant, of this redemption, of this promise. That doesn't mean, Abram, that you can live any way you want to live.
So did that imply that God had told Abram some of his Torah or some of his...
We know he did.
That would be Genesis chapter 26.
Yes.
Where he says in verse 5, he says, verse 4, he says, I will multiply your seed like the stars of the sky. I will give your seed all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth will continually be blessed.
God's talking to Isaac here after Abraham has died.
Yes. Because Abraham listened to my voice, kept my charge, my commands, or mitzvot, my decrees, and my instructions is what the translation says, but the instruction is really the term translated for Torah. So Abraham listened to his voice, kept his charge, my mitzvot, my decrees, and my Torah.
So God did share at least some things with him that later end up in the Mosaic covenant. But
he said
that was not the terms of his redemption, and that was not the terms of the promise. They were signs of that. How Abraham lived was a sign that he followed God Most High. Right?
Yes, he did. Those are evidences of the fact that he was in relationship with him. And that's really what our walk with God is supposed to be. It's supposed to be the evidences that we believe what we say we do. That's why the charge of hypocrisy is such a negative thing, because we're not living up to what we say we've agreed to. And that was one of the points made a little while ago, that we don't have to understand everything at the beginning. Our salvation, our justification is not dependent upon us having everything figured out and having a perfect understanding of things. We actually grow and learn and are sanctified along our journey with God. And so he reveals more and more of himself and his ways to us. And his ways and himself go hand in hand.
Yes.
And I remember in talking about one of these Torah portions, relating it to getting married. How you don't know everything about the person you're getting married to. There are still some things that are going to be a little secret.
Or even just not yet discussed.
Not yet discussed or talked about. But if you waited until you knew everything about the other person, then you'd never get married, because that's basically saying I'm not going to trust you until I understand everything and know everything. I'm not going to commit to you until I know everything. And that's really not how God in his covenant here with Abraham works. He's like, I want you to believe me. I want you to trust me. I want you to know. You will get to know me when we are in relationship.
Right.
And so, like the marriage, you still will go through the ceremony and get married, even though you don't know everything about the other person.
And you spend a lifetime getting to know that person, just like we spend a lifetime getting to know God. And like he said, God, his ways are representative of who he is, right? If Kelly were to tell me he loves me, but then never demonstrated that love in any way, shape, or form, it would be hard to believe that he loved me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So how he acts or his ways represent who he is. And it's the same with God.
Or think about it like this, on a sign, circumcision was the sign of the covenant. That was one of those things that was setting them apart and showing that they are in relationship with Adonai. And so that was the sign of their relationship. Well, what's the sign of a marriage or someone being married? Isn't it the ring on your finger?
Mm-hmm.
Does it make sense to walk around with a ring on your finger but live as if you're not married?
We call that adultery.
Yeah, they call that adultery. It doesn't make sense to claim to be in a covenant relationship of marriage. You have limited yourself to certain behaviors.
Yes.
That are unique to that marriage and to the exclusion of others. And that's okay. That's the way it's supposed to be. There's nothing wrong with that.
That's everything right about it.
And that's one reason why our country is going off track. That's one of the evidences that our country is going off track, because we don't take the covenant of marriage as seriously as we used to as a nation.
Marriage, family, all of those things.
And if we can't take this relationship seriously, then we're certainly not going to take the covenant that exists between God and man as seriously either.
Right. Okay. So if you go, let's just keep reading. Keep reading chapter 17.
Okay.
Go to through verse 8.
So my heart's desire is to make my covenant between me and you, and then I will multiply you exceedingly much. Abram fell on his face, and God spoke with him, saying, For my part, because my covenant is with you, you will be the father of a multitude of nations. And by father of a multitude of nations, does that mean they're all descendant from him, or are they all Jewish? Is that what he's trying to say here? He is the father of many nations because, as Paul had talked about, we are Abraham's seed by faith. So you will be a father of a multitude of nations. Verse 5 says, no longer will your name be Abram, which means exalted father, but your name will be Abraham, because I make you the father of a multitude of nations. Yes, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings will come forth from you. Of course, which one is the most important king that comes from him? Messiah. Yes, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your seed after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant in order to be your God and your seed's God after you. I will give to you and to your seed after you the land where you are an outsider, the whole land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be your God,
and
or their God.
What kind of covenant? An everlasting covenant.
An everlasting covenant.
Remember, you can't change the terms of the covenants.
That was Galatians.
So that is an everlasting covenant, right? His physical descendants and the land are part of that everlasting covenant that comes to even include the nations. Right? We cannot separate the Abrahamic covenant from his physical descendants and the land that God promised. We cannot. Because Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus, is the King of the Jews. He is the King of Israel. He will rule and reign from Jerusalem. So to separate the Jewish people from this covenant and the land from this covenant is to separate them from Yeshua and
from the promise.
The kingdom, from the promise. And we can't do that. We have no right to do that. We shouldn't even want to do that. Because we should want to see God fulfill his covenant completely. Because
that's one of the blessings that Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 2. You know, the covenants are ongoing and continuous, and they are not going to be negated. That's the point she was just making. But we as Gentiles are on the outside of that. You know, the nations are on the outside of that until something important happens. That's what Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 2. He says, this is our condition as Gentiles in verse 12. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 12 says, at that time, you, and he's talking to the Gentiles, were separate from Messiah. You were excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, from the nation, and strangers to the covenants of promise.
The first one being the Abrahamic covenant.
The covenant of promise starts with Abraham, having no hope and without God in the world. And if that's where it ended, we would be on the outside looking in.
Always.
He would have his covenant of promise with the Jewish people only, if that's where it ended. But the verse continues in verse 13, but now, in Messiah Yeshua, in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off, that's us Gentiles, have been brought near by the blood of the Messiah. It's as if, just as the Jewish people were saved by the blood over the doorpost, we are saved by the blood bringing us under that house. Remember, as everybody who's in that house where the blood appears, those are the ones who survive the last plague. Right? So we are brought near, we are brought in, we are brought underneath that protection, that covering
of that blood, because that blood represented his blood.
That blood represented his blood, because Messiah is our Passover, our Pesach lamb.
We all come the same way.
We all are redeemed by the same blood. So you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of the Messiah. And then verse 19 says, so then you are no longer strangers and foreigners.
That's what we were. We were strangers and foreigners.
And everything, everything about us had been changed. So where we were excluded from the Commonwealth of Israel, we were excluded in Messiah. Now we are included in Messiah. If we were strangers to the covenants of the promise, now we are heirs of the promise, of the covenants of promise. We are included in those. We're not strangers anymore. We're family. Right?
Which is what that goes on to say.
Right. So verse 19, so then you are no longer strangers and foreigners. You're not on the outside anymore, but you are fellow citizens with God's people. Citizens of what? Citizens of a nation or a kingdom. You are citizens, fellow citizens with God's people and members of God's household.
We've been brought into the tent of Abraham. And again, like we said earlier, Abraham brought in who was ever willing and wanted to learn about his God. He brought them in to teach them about his God. And that made them part of his tent, part of his estate, if you will, part of his family.
And just like in Egypt, the Israelites brought people in, maybe some neighbors, maybe some friends, into their homes on the night of the last plague. And when they put the blood on the doorposts, no one was allowed to leave. But they were protected. Everybody in the house that had the blood on the doorposts was protected. And we have been brought near. We have been brought in. That's what the Abrahamic Covenant is supposed to be. The Abrahamic Covenant is the one under which we are redeemed.
And that is key. And I think that's the one thing that we were never taught. You know, that nobody ever said. But that is the essential element of the Abrahamic Covenant. It's a promise of descendants. It's a promise of land. It's a promise of a future. It's a promise to bring in people from other nations. It is the promise of redemption.
And what Abraham saw was a future kingdom. A future kingdom made up of Jew and Gentile. Both citizens of the of that kingdom, living under the authority of a perfect king, living by the ways of God,
living in the house,
members of the household. And Yeshua, he is his high priesthood. He is the mediator under the terms of the Abrahamic Covenant. That's the whole point of the book of Hebrews, calling him the high priest. And
so he's the one who says who's in the house and who's not in the house.
So the Abrahamic Covenant is the essential starting point. That's how we come in. We come in by faith. We believe, and it is imparted to us. It is credited to us as righteousness.
And you know, there's something else there, another parallel. Abraham would stand at the entrance of his tent. That's where we see him, even when he sees the three strangers, the angels, and coming to him, right? One of them being the Lord. And so that's where he was. That's where he would be. Because he would see people walk by and he would try to tell them about his God to bring them in. Well, who's at the door? Who is the door? Yeshua is the door. He's the one who stands at the door and knocks, but he's also the one at the door saying, come in.
Inviting.
He's the door. He's the one who decides who's in, who's not. if that invitation is accepted and that person says, I want to come into your tent, I want to come into your house and learn your ways and learn about God, your God.
Just like
Come on in.
Just like Ruth.
Yes, just like Ruth.
Going
just like
home
Ruth.
with Naomi. Your God will be my God. Yeah. That's where we start. The Abrahamic Covenant is an essential knowledge of that. It is the one by which we are redeemed.
Amen.
Well, if y'all have any questions or any comments you'd want to add, be sure and maybe write them down in there and type them in with the comment section, and we'll try to get to them. Haven't seen any of those yet. Have you?
No.
Not a one.
Why not?
No questions, no nothing.
Well, I will say this. No questions. There have been some comments.
Encouragements. Yes, there certainly have been.
And we're very appreciative of those. Thank you.
But yeah, leave some questions or comments or topics even that you'd want to hear talked about. I hope all of this made sense. It's been kind of a long day for both of us, so we weren't able to necessarily order it out like we usually do. So sometimes it was a little bit of a stream of consciousness. At least it was on me. But be sure and like and share the video and share it with people just to hear talking about the Abrahamic Covenant.
Yes.
We'll be talking about the other ones in the next few weeks.
Yes, so we'll actually start with the Mosaic Covenant next week. And I'm assuming we'll do that in 1 week. We'll see. And then, of course, there's the Davidic Covenant and then the New Covenant. So we're going to go through all of them.
Because it's with all of those that share the gospel, the good news.
They are all part of the story.
And one does not negate the other.
Correct.
All right. Well, y'all have a good night. Leave us some thoughts or comments. And we will see y'all again next week, the Lord willing.
Shalom.
Shalom.